Millions of people trusted Dr. Phil to help fix broken families, save struggling marriages, and guide people through life's hardest moments. On television, he always seemed calm, confident, and full of answers. But long before the cameras arrived, there was a chapter of his own life that almost nobody talked about. Years after his first marriage ended, his ex-wife shared claims that painted a very different picture of the man the world thought it knew. The question is simple, but the answer is far more complicated than most people realize. Before we go any further, here's something to think about. Do you believe a person's private life should change how we see their public success? Let me know what you think in the comments. For years, Dr. Phil became one of the most recognizable faces on television. Every weekday, millions watched him offer advice with confidence. His words helped build an empire of books, television shows, and public appearances. To many viewers, he represented honesty, wisdom, and common sense. But every famous story has a beginning, and this one didn't start under bright studio lights. It began in Oklahoma, where Philip Calvin McGraw grew up in a family that valued sports, education, and hard work. Friends described him as determined and competitive. Those qualities would later help him build an incredible career. Yet, before fame ever knocked on his door, another important event changed his life forever. As a young man, Phil met Debbie Higgins. Like many young couples, they shared dreams about the future. They fell in love quickly and believed they could build a happy life together. In 1970, they married while both were still very young. At the time, nobody could have imagined that this short marriage would become one of the most discussed parts of Dr. Phil's past decades later. At first, everything appeared normal. They were simply two young people trying to find their place in the world. But according to later interviews and public statements, the relationship soon became difficult. Debbie Higgins McCall would later describe problems inside the marriage that she said were hidden from the outside world. Those claims attracted major media attention years later, although they reflected her account of the relationship rather than findings established in court. Dr. Phil has rarely spoken publicly in detail about the marriage, making the story even more mysterious. And that mystery only grew as his career reached incredible heights. Because while his first marriage quietly ended after only a few years, almost no one knew that one day the man involved would become America's most famous television psychologist. The past seemed buried, until old stories began returning to the headlines, raising questions that fans are still debating today. But before those accusations ever resurfaced, Dr. Phil had to rebuild his life from the ground up. The choices he made next would completely change his future, and eventually lead him to one of the biggest television success stories in history. When Dr. Phil's first marriage ended in the early 1970s, it seemed like a private chapter that would quietly disappear with time. There were no television cameras, no social media, and no national headlines. Just two young people going their separate ways. But what looked like an ordinary divorce would later become one of the most talked about parts of his life. Phil didn't stay focused on the past. Instead, he poured his energy into building a future. He continued his education, studying psychology and learning how people think, behave, and make decisions. It wasn't an easy journey. Becoming a licensed psychologist required years of hard work, and success was anything but guaranteed. Yet those who knew him often described him as someone who refused to quit once he had set a goal. Then something happened that changed everything. Not long after his first marriage ended, Phil met Robin Jo Jameson, the woman who would later become Robin McGraw. Their relationship moved in a very different direction. They married in 1976 and eventually built a family together. Over the years, Robin became one of the most recognizable partners in daytime television, often appearing beside her husband and speaking about the importance of family and faith. But none of that fame existed yet. At the time, Phil was still trying to build a career. He worked in psychology before later moving into consulting, helping businesses and lawyers understand human behavior. One of the companies he co-founded, Courtroom Sciences, specialized in trial consulting, helping legal teams prepare for major court cases. It was a field that combined psychology with strategy, and it quietly made him highly respected behind the scenes. Still, almost nobody outside the legal world knew his name. Then fate stepped in. In the late 1990s, one high-profile legal case brought Phil into contact with media icon Oprah Winfrey. She had been sued after comments made about the beef industry and hired consultants to help her legal team prepare for trial. According to Oprah and multiple interviews given over the years, Phil's advice impressed her. She later invited him onto her television show to share practical life advice with viewers. That invitation changed his life forever. Almost overnight, audiences connected with his direct style. Unlike many experts, he spoke in simple language. He didn't hide behind complicated psychology terms. Instead, he talked the way everyday people talked. Viewers loved it. Ratings climbed. More appearances followed. Soon, television executives realized they weren't just looking at another guest expert. They were looking at someone who could host his own show. Everything seemed perfect. The man who had once struggled to build a career was suddenly becoming one of the biggest personalities on daytime television. His books became bestsellers. His audience grew into the millions. Around the world, people saw him as someone who could solve problems others couldn't. But there was one thing almost nobody was talking about. The first marriage had faded into the background. Very few viewers knew anything about Debbie Higgins McCall or the life Dr. Phil had before fame. For years, it remained little more than a forgotten footnote in his biography. Then, just as his reputation reached incredible heights, old stories began finding new audiences. Before we reveal how those claims returned to the spotlight and why they sparked so much debate, make sure you subscribe. We uncover the stories behind famous public figures by separating documented facts from rumor, and what happened next became one of the most discussed chapters of Dr. Phil's career. Because once the past came back, it didn't just make headlines. It made millions of people wonder whether they truly knew the man they had trusted for so many years. By the early 2000s, Dr. Phil was everywhere. His television show quickly became one of the highest-rated daytime programs in America. Families watched him after school, parents quoted his advice, and his books filled bookstore shelves. Through interviews, public appearances, and best-selling titles, he built a brand based on trust and straightforward advice. To millions of viewers, he wasn't just a television host. He was someone who seemed to understand people. Every episode followed a familiar pattern. Guests arrived with difficult problems. Dr. Phil asked tough questions, and by the end, many left with hope for a better future. That formula made him one of the most recognizable personalities on television. His success stretched far beyond TV. He wrote best-selling books, launched new media projects, and became a regular guest on major news programs. Robin McGraw also became a public figure in her own right, often speaking about their marriage and family life. Together, they appeared to represent stability, loyalty, and lasting love. From the outside, everything looked almost perfect. But success has a strange way of bringing old stories back into the spotlight. As Dr. Phil's fame grew, reporters and biographers became curious about the parts of his life that had received little attention. One subject kept appearing again and again: his first marriage to Debbie Higgins McCall. For years, very little had been said publicly about it. Then Debbie began sharing her version of what happened. In interviews and later public discussions, she claimed that the marriage was not what many people imagined. Among other allegations, she described controlling behavior and said she felt pressured during the relationship. Those statements received media attention because they came from someone who had known Dr. Phil before the world did. It is important to understand, however, that these were her allegations. They were not findings established by a court, and Dr. Phil has not publicly accepted those claims as true. He has generally chosen not to discuss his first marriage in detail, leaving many questions unanswered. That silence only made people more curious. Some believed Debbie's account deserved serious attention. Others argued that it was impossible to fully judge a relationship that had ended decades earlier without hearing every side in detail. As newspapers, television programs, and online articles revisited the story, public opinion became divided. One thing was certain: the image of the confident television psychologist suddenly seemed more complicated than before. It raised an uncomfortable question. Can someone give life-changing advice to millions while still having painful chapters in their own past? The debate spread across talk shows, magazines, and online forums. Some fans continued supporting Dr. Phil without hesitation. Others wondered whether public figures should be judged more by their private lives. Many people watching right now may have a chapter of their own that they wish they could erase. This part of Dr. Phil's story is a reminder that success doesn't automatically silence the past. Sometimes, the moments we think are forgotten return years later when we least expect them. But even these headlines were not the end of the story, because new criticism would eventually target not only Dr. Phil's past, but also the way he handled guests on his own television show. And that controversy threatened something even bigger than his reputation. For years, Dr. Phil's show looked unstoppable. Millions tuned in every week. Guests trusted him with their deepest struggles. Television networks saw him as one of the safest bets in daytime TV. But the bigger his audience became, the more people started asking difficult questions, not about his first marriage this time, but about the show itself. Some former guests claimed they felt pressured to share painful moments on camera. Critics argued that deeply personal problems were sometimes being turned into entertainment. Mental health professionals also questioned whether serious psychological issues could really be handled in front of a live audience. The debate grew louder every year. Then several high-profile interviews brought even more attention. One of the most discussed involved actress Shelley Duvall. In 2016, viewers watched as she spoke openly about her mental health struggles. After the episode aired, many mental health experts, journalists, and fellow actors criticized the program. They argued that someone in such a vulnerable condition should have received private treatment instead of appearing on national television. Dr. Phil defended the interview, saying the goal was to connect Duvall with professional care. His team later stated that treatment options had been offered. Even so, the controversy refused to disappear. And that wasn't the only criticism. Over the years, some former employees and guests also spoke publicly about their experiences on the show. Their stories varied, and not every claim was verified. In several cases, Dr. Phil's representatives disputed allegations or provided different explanations. Like many long-running television programs, the show became the subject of public debate rather than simple agreement. Suddenly, the man who had spent decades asking hard questions was being asked difficult questions himself. For some fans, none of it changed how they felt. They believed his advice had genuinely helped people and pointed to the countless families who said the show changed their lives. Others felt differently. They wondered whether television ratings sometimes came before compassion. They questioned where the line should be drawn between helping someone and creating compelling television. The conversation spread across news outlets, documentaries, podcasts, and social media. Once again, Dr. Phil found himself at the center of a national discussion. Yet despite all the criticism, his career had already left a huge mark on television. Very few daytime hosts remained as recognizable or influential for as long as he did. But perhaps the biggest surprise was still waiting. After years at the top, the Dr. Phil show eventually came to an end, closing one of the longest-running chapters in daytime television. Many expected him to quietly retire. Instead, he chose a different path. He launched new media projects and continued speaking to audiences through other platforms, proving that even after decades in the spotlight, he wasn't ready to disappear. But the biggest lesson from his journey isn't really about television. It's about how every public figure has two stories, the one the world sees and the one that remains the subject of debate. And that's exactly where this documentary ends. When people hear the name Dr. Phil, they often think of one thing: a man giving advice from a television stage. For more than 2 decades, he became one of the most recognized faces in daytime TV. Millions of people watched his show, read his books, and followed his guidance through some of life's hardest moments. Whether people agreed with every opinion he shared or not, very few could deny the size of his influence. But influence doesn't protect anyone from criticism. As his career grew, so did the public's interest in his personal life and professional decisions. His first marriage, the allegations made years later by his ex-wife, and the debates surrounding some of his television interviews all became part of his story. The important thing to remember is this: some parts of that story are documented facts, while others remain disputed claims. Responsible storytelling means recognizing the difference. Public records confirm the marriage and divorce. Debbie Higgins McCall publicly shared her account of the relationship. Dr. Phil has generally not discussed that marriage in detail or publicly accepted those allegations. That leaves a story that continues to be debated rather than one with simple answers. And maybe that's exactly why people are still talking about it today. Because real life is rarely as clear as television makes it seem. Many people watching right now may be carrying a chapter of their own that others don't know about. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's a failed relationship. Maybe it's a decision they wish they could change. Dr. Phil's journey reminds us that no matter how successful someone becomes, the past often follows them. But it also reminds us that every story has more than one side, and rushing to judgment without all the facts can be just as dangerous as ignoring difficult questions. In the end, Dr. Phil's legacy will probably never be defined by just one headline. Some people will remember him as a television pioneer who helped countless families. Others will remember the controversies, the criticism, and the unanswered questions. Both views have shaped how history sees him, and perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. Behind every famous face is a complicated human story, one filled with victories, failures, praise, criticism, and moments the public may never fully understand. But this isn't the only famous story where the public image and the private reality seem completely different. In our next documentary, we'll uncover another celebrity whose hidden past shocked millions. And the truth is even more surprising than anyone expected.